Good evening. My name is Henry Jung, and I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Culture and Community here at Emily Carr University. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples, and we offer our thanks. Tonight, we are pleased and excited to present Random Acts of Legacy, an award-winning documentary produced and directed by Ali Kazimi, followed by a conversation with the filmmaker and Chris Lee, director of the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program at UBC. Now we're going to try to run the film.
It's such an honor to share a stage with a filmmaker that I've admired for so long and to have this conversation. But like many of us, I think here, I first got to know your work by watching Continuous Journey, your very well-known documentary about the Komagata Maru incident. And you remember in that documentary, there's a moment when you show us this home video footage you found of the Komagata Maru in the archives. And it sort of made me think after watching that film that you have a certain reverence for the image. And watching the film tonight just really confirmed that sense of reverence towards found images. So I just want to actually begin by asking you, what does it feel like to watch something like a home movie after 70 years? I mean, is there a specific feeling that comes to you, or?
I have a reverence for the moving image, but even more so for the moving image that specifically is about that shows people of color in Canada and the U.S. And for me, that was how this journey started. When I saw a photograph, a frame grab on eBay, where I bought this footage, of Edith in Lake Louise, I immediately asked myself, what is a Chinese woman doing in Lake Louise dressed to the nines in the 1940s? There's got to be a story here. And it's this journey started by me trying to reconstruct my grandfather's story, and I've been working on a film about my grandfather's with no footage. And I just don't have any image, any moving image. And then when I found this treasure trove of this family archive, I said, this is amazing. And so there was a particular kind of, and that recognition came because I had spent so much time in various archives looking for images, moving images of people of color in both Canada and the US, and knowing that there's very little material out there. And certainly nothing like this.
I was actually going to ask how you became the bleeping guy on eBay who almost bid out someone else. But did you win the bid? Or did you?
Let's say I struck a deal outside eBay. I spent it was a complete leap of faith. The seller and I decided I think it was around, we agreed on $2,000. And I sent him the check, a bank draft, and I hoped something would come back. And this box came, and yeah, it was in worse condition than I thought it was going to be.
Can you tell us a little bit more about restoring or getting the film into a workable state? I think there's a little bit about it in the film, but can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, I'd given up on it. You know, at York University where I teach, we'd had a panel where archivists had come and talked about film restoration. And when I told them about the state of the film, they just said, you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars. You know, it's not, this is, just forget about it. And they were quite categorical about it. And then this retired engineer walked into our studio one day, and my studio manager said, you might want to talk to John. So I did, and he basically said, look, it's an all or nothing situation. How badly do you want this done? You could lose it. I'm going to try an experiment. So I said, I have nothing to lose at this stage, and he restored it. It was quite amazing.
And one thing I thought was really amazing, just watching the footage, is there's almost the way that you turn the damaged film into a kind of aesthetic motive itself. So we're watching images that have decayed, and we're seeing the image decay sort of in front of our eyes. And I just want to ask you to talk about, so how did you work with the state of the film, and how did you incorporate that into your aesthetic?
By completely embracing it, by not lamenting it or that the fact that it was damaged, but by celebrating its decay. I was fortunate in working with Gary Popovich, who is one of Canada's leading experimental filmmakers, and bringing him on as a collaborator, it was amazing because we were immediately right there. He just loved the decay. He loved and then when I worked with the sound designer, Phil Strong, who I've collaborated with Continuous Journey as well, the approach we took was that we would again, the sound itself would embrace the decay, and the music is deliberately distorted, it's disrupted, it's repeated, and it mirrors the texture.
Can you talk about how sort of the fun, the form of the film came together? I mean, did you interview the family while you were restoring the film? Did you restore the film first? Sort of how did it all, the process, and when did you kind of know the form that we saw today? When did you kind of come put it together?
I first put I got the film restored, and then using the notes on the packages, I kind of put them in the best chronological order I could. So it was just over an hour of film, and then I sought out Irina, and my conceit in this was very simple. I would show Irina and Henry, who's here, wonderful Henry Yu, and Chume Ho. I would show them as they watched the film, I would get their responses. And that happened in 2010, 2011. And then it took about 2 years off and on between my schedule and Gary's schedule to try and find a structure for the film. It was a hard film to structure.
Say a bit more about that.
Well, we initially the film was going to be about Silas Fung, the collector. This was about the obsessive collector, and it was about Silas. Then when we actually sat down to edit the film, I realized that Silas is behind the camera, so he's rarely in front of the camera. So to make a film about Silas was going to be impossible. And then Edith appeared. Edith's story emerged, and that was an interesting moment because I realized that while I was trying to reconstruct the story from the margins of race and class, there was another story within it which wasn't documented anywhere. Whereas Silas's name appears on various websites, and he's got footnotes in books on Chicago history. Edith is nowhere to be found, but it was because of Edith the family had the economic status that it achieved. And Edith happened to be on camera many a times.
Was the family, like you mentioned that Irina was thrilled to hear from you. Did you get a sense of how the larger family, the extended family, took this project? Because I mean, Sharon Clara, that's an amazing set of footage that you got. It looked like she passed away.
She
at some
did
point
pass away.
during
Clara was amazing. Clara was on email with me all the time at 99. She was the most engaged person with me. But you know what? The interesting part was with Irina's children. My initial thing was that maybe the entire family could watch this. And Irina said to me, "Great concept, Ali, but it's not going to work." And I was a bit taken aback. I said, what do you mean? She said, "My kids don't want to watch it." I said, "Hang on a second, wait a minute. This is their family footage. This is grandparents. If somebody said that to me, I would travel anywhere to watch it." And she said, "No, great concept. No, not going to work. They don't want to do it. So so I said, okay, you're it then. It'll just be you, and that's what happened. I did try to interview other people. I did have a small screening in Chinatown in Chicago where we brought together some friends that were Irina's contemporaries to watch the film. But besides recognizing themselves in the footage a couple of times, there was not a lot there. The thing that did emerge was that they all referred to Silas. I remember these are people in their 80s as Silas, but they still referred to Edith as Mrs. Fung.
Even though she had such a illustrious career of her own. And
Yeah, but she was very formal with them, and he just loved kids, and he was a child magnet, and they all hung out with Silas, but Mrs. Fung was.
I have a sense that not Edith, Irina talked about this history with her kids, or do you have a sense that this was passed on in some way? And have the kids seen the film?
The kids have seen the film and they love it. I've had a wonderful dinner with them with not just one of her daughters, but her granddaughter as well, and. Her daughter wrote me this lovely email where she said she'd watched the film several times and cried her way through it, and that she didn't know this history, and that I had given her back the history.
It's a really wonderful moment where Irina says, she doesn't have any sad memories, but she's holding a handkerchief there, and it's moving, I think, for the audience to see that moment. But was it an emotional experience for her to see this film? Had she seen this film for herself?
She hadn't seen the film. As she says in the film itself, this is classic home movie moment where people see the films once and then it's put away and then you don't see it. That moment actually where she started crying happened right in the beginning of the interview.
Oh, it did. Okay.
And she was just overwhelmed that she kept saying, "But you have all this stuff just to interview me?" Because there was a crew, there were lights, and then she just she had that moment, and then she never went back there again. She was.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions about, a series of questions about the home movie as a medium, and to use that maybe as a way of thinking about some more cultural and social issues that obviously come up in this film. And I'm interested in how the home movie becomes for you a way of accessing a past that's no longer here. But what's really interesting and complicated, now I'm trying to work this out myself, is on the one hand, I think somewhere Henry says that this is a normal life, or you see a normal life of a family, but then of course he also tells us this is completely abnormal in terms of the history of Chinese at the time, in terms of the relative scarcity of Chinese families. So what do we make of a normal scene that's so abnormal?
I think different people will make different things. It was one of the things that happened. There was a young photographer who was third generation in Chicago, third generation Chinese, and he was deeply moved. For him, the important thing was that they looked all American. And this was something that he said, I'm going to hold on for the rest of my life. This is just seeing the way they dress, the way they are. It just gives me a complete sense of place and location that has been missing. And for him, it was just their being, and for me, the having read up a lot and having dealt with the issues of Asian exclusion in the first half of the 20th century, the class issue was huge, right? My both recognizing that they were very incredibly well turned out all the time. They had expensive cars, lived in an expensive neighborhood, but starting from the very fact that he was shooting 16 millimeter film, which was an extremely expensive and fairly elite media at the time.
And so is there a kind of extravagance that happens with this kind of footage and this kind of activity? And
I think I'm not quite sure if it's extravagance. I think it's as Henry aptly says, it's part of the American dream, and it is literally the term home movie was invented by was coined by Hollywood. as a way of, and Hollywood used to publish a magazine called The Home Movie, in which they taught you the film grammar and how to edit, how to shoot, the language of film, and the term then became synonymous with taking films of your
Because
family.
you're so careful to keep reminding us not to be duped by the home movie as being natural or real, right? So, I mean, there's a moment where you talk about how, as a filmmaker, you love the fact that he never crosses a certain line, how he does his editing on camera. I think that was the term that you used. And then there's another point where I think Arena says it's all staged.
Yep.
You know, they're like, you know, he, as you are coming to her house with a camera and crew, you know, he had the apparatus as well.
And not just the apparatus, but if you put this film and what Silas is doing against what's happening with, say, the practice of documentary, it's quite astonishing. The handheld documentaries don't start really happening till the 60s. In the silent era, there's very little handheld work done. He does one of my favorite sequences, which is all in camera, is Irina going to school, which is all staged. Right? Edith bids her daughter goodbye. Then he follows Irina as she skips down the driveway, then goes skipping down the sidewalk, and then he gets into his car, and he does this tracking shot from the car, and it's all, for me, this was jaw-dropping, just in terms of the craft that he is putting into place.
Did Irina recall sort of being directed, like literally being directed by her father like that?
Yeah, well, Irina does repeat herself, so she just kept saying, he just staged everything. Everything was staged. So, which meant that...
And that was normal for her.
That was normal for her. Yeah, he was very directive. Yeah, he wanted to be in the films himself. So, as she says in the beginning, he would hand somebody the camera and say, take a shot of me.
I mean, it keeps striking me that this kind of mixture of being staged and yet living that is a really interesting metaphor for race, right? And the ways in which many people live the realities of race. And so despite the kind of privilege that we see and despite the kind of, comfort of the home and the sort of exceptional nature of this family, the movies themselves, maybe perhaps in spite of themselves, have a lot to teach us about their lives as Chinese Americans.
Yep.
And to reflect then on what it might mean for us to think about diversity and race today in film. And those connections I found really moving. And I think they come out in all sorts of different ways in terms of how you put the film together. But I wanted to sort of maybe ask you about, did you have a sense after working with this archive that you saw the kind of lived reality of race differently? I mean, you're not coming into this topic blind. I mean, this has been your life work, really. But I don't know whether this particular archive changed how you think about this topic in some way.
Well, yeah. I mean, what was interesting for me was to engage with the lived experience of race in and its ordinary manifestations, right? In the most quotidian ways possible, which get beyond the larger histories of race. Because in spite of all the stuff that we know, the exclusions, the horrific discriminations, the racism, the overt and the covert racism, people lived lives, and people lived complex, rich, ordinary lives, and that was the beauty of it with this footage for me, and that was it was interesting having said that. Three editors walked away from this film project because they couldn't see what I was seeing and these were people I deeply respect and I admired, who I've worked with, but they kept saying to me, "This is too banal. This is just too. Nothing is happening. Nothing happens." And I kept saying, "But everything happens."
Everything and nothing. I mean, how do we understand a history of, say, Asian Canadian, Asian American presence that is about nothing happening?
Well, and what's supposed to happen is, I guess, trauma and tragedy and oppression.
We know those stories.
We know those
Yeah,
stories.
right.
But what happens in between those stories? Right? What are the lives lived in between, and how do we see them, and how do we understand them? So all of these, for me, the picnics are wonderful. The other thing that I found very moving, was the amount of physical affection in the family.
Yes, absolutely.
There's a lot of hugging. There's a lot of physical affection.
Staged affection.
Staged affection. Staged
To
affection.
remind you,
But
know what's going on.
but imagine that. But I want you to imagine that, Chris, that he would consider it important to have staged affection, right? So that we're going to set up the camera. I think he sets up, and the family's going to sit, and the kids are going to come and hug and kiss us. And they do it impeccably and very movingly, I think.
Right. And so that's where, the commentary that you and many of the experts that you interview, I mean, that's where that jarringness comes out, right? You want us to keep remembering that this is staged and this is not real, but whatever that might mean. But one thing I wanted to maybe actually to think a little, or to maybe just talk a little bit about is, going back to something you said earlier, maybe in the work that we do, let's say in Asian Canadian, Asian American studies, because of the politics that have happened since that time period, I think we are more open to questions of resistance, of sort of overt statements of identity. I think there's a grammar around being a racialized minority that was not available to the filmmakers. And that might account for why some of your colleagues thought this was a more banal archive, because this doesn't fit into that. But I'm also thinking, but it seems like the other piece that goes with resistance is respectability, right? And there's such a kind of desire for respectability in this film. So I just wanted you maybe to talk a little bit more about how do we, who are much more familiar with critical discourses about race, who are much more familiar with sort of political questions of resistance, how do we look at kind of archive, and what do we do with it? And I feel like, if I may say so, I feel like you're struggling with that a little bit in the film too, because you drop a lot of important information just to remind us to kind of frame it in certain ways. But in some ways, do the images kind of run away from you a little bit there?
I'm trying to, I'm trying to locate the film, and so this idea of respectability, the idea of the beginnings of the model minority, they all manifest in the footage. Not just the growth of the middle class, but really the idea of the model minority,
Yes,
and dressing correctly, and all of that is there. But all of that is then. I really like the sequence when Silas and Edith and their friends come out, and they're all dressed. Right? Again, it's very staged. They're literally like stepping onto the stage, and the stage happens to be their front step, and they're wearing suits, and Edith is dressed in a business suit. But I do, so that's why I brought in this idea of the Life magazine piece. But I also wanted to problematize this comfort around nationalism and identity, and bring in what was happening with the black population there, and how did Chinatown receive the African Americans living around it? Because even when, and it still exists, because even when I was there, I stayed in a hotel just outside Chinatown that was owned and operated by African Americans. And I asked them about Chinatown, and they had not been there. And it was literally a 10-minute walk. And the receptionist, the frontline staff, they said, "Oh, I've never been there."
Spatial separation is very
The geographic, spatial separation, and that's why I wanted to speak about the geography and race in Chicago as well, because so I like doing that. That's the way my brain works. That's the way I love exploring something, is to look at both spatial geographies and then horizontal and history. But I think it's still a struggle. Right? I mean, it's still unpacking the material. In many
And one
ways.
thing I'm thinking as I'm watching the film now is how to unpack a desire for Americanness that's also a coded desire for whiteness. I mean, when she talks about I ate Caucasian food, and she literally names it, and it's interesting because I think other part she talks is a Slovak family. I mean, so it's not to say that this is the monolithic category, but of course, when she codes it, like I get to eat white food.
Yep.
So what do we do with? And that was sort of that was the desire that she had as a child, and that sort of it seems to have kind of permeated this family in different ways. What do we make of that? I mean, how do we?
I'm not sure if that was a desire she had. It was just a treat for her. It was just a difference. And I loved her idea of Caucasian food. I kept thinking, this is a new restaurant sign,
cuisine
right?
that
It's a
we
new
just
cuisine, Caucasian food. We can have Chinese food and Caucasian food. But and she to this day she makes a distinction about. So when she took my wife and I out for dinner when we met her, we went to a Chinese restaurant and we had a banquet. Right, this was a huge celebratory thing. There was going to be no Caucasian food there, and but it was this. But again, I'm not sure if with her especially there isn't the desire for whiteness. But I think her brother Danny dealt with that. He struggled with that, and he was traumatized by his childhood experience of literally having the Chinese language beaten out of him at school and being shamed by having failed kindergarten because and he.
It's not an unusual story.
No, it's not an unusual
for
story.
second generation immigrants. I mean,
No.
that's the kind of classic assimilation story. There.
Absolutely, absolutely. Whereas Irina can still speak Cantonese today.
And Danny's story isn't very prominent. I mean, he's passed away, and there's some sense that maybe his passing somehow got the footage to where it was. But were you not able to find a lot of information about him?
The parents, the siblings were estranged,
Oh, I see.
and they had a very bad falling out. And one of the conditions, I only had one condition from Irina, that I could not. So Danny had passed away, but his wife is still around. I could not interview her. So
And you have not had contact with that part of that side of the family.
I have now. Once it went out on Facebook, her son, Danny's son, contacted me and said that they do have some more footage.
And is that how they got the? Is that how the footage got to the auctioneers at the beginning?
We're not sure.
So that's still a mystery. Yeah.
That's a mystery. That's a mystery.
So I think we have a few minutes left. I wanted to maybe zoom out a little bit and think about the act of collecting. I mean, you mentioned just during our conversation that Silas Fong was known as a collector.
Yep.
Obviously, he had his interest in the museum and whatnot. And it seems to me that what's moving about his work is that it's almost like his attempt to not let go of a certain important moment in his life. So I think about, for example, going to Expo 86 in Vancouver as a kid, and any number of events that we may have experienced where we don't want to let go of a certain kind of excitement. And so he kept that, maybe perhaps in very extreme ways, but he kept it. And then wondering about what kinds of feelings he would have had, in getting those objects coming in. Is it nostalgia? Is it excitement? Was he? And I don't know whether you have any sense of what his approach to collecting was. I mean, because
I think it was a deeply American act for him. It was because the Chicago's World Fair was about the American project, and for him this was the most. This is what he sort of staked his claim on being American through this specific process of collecting.
So maybe let me flip the question around a little bit. What's a filmmaker like you doing collecting this stuff? and I ask this because one of the first things you say in the film is, "I am a South Asian Canadian secular Muslim." You sort of lay your cards out there, but you don't really go back to that.
No.
But it does seem to beg the question of what kinds of boundaries did you have to cross, and what does it mean for you to collect footage and to put it, if not in a museum, into a kind of presentable form for the public?
Yeah, I mean, I was, again, I always think that we don't seek out films or stories, they seek us out. And it becomes a process where you trust what's happening, you're open to it, which is not an easy process because it's often frightening. And this film could have been easily stopped by Irina saying, "Who are you to make this film? I don't want you to make this film." There would have been no film there, right? The opposite happened. I mean, there was this instant connection. That interview you saw with her was the second time I met her. I met her the first day. We had a quick chat. I said, "I'm coming back tomorrow with the crew," and that was it. And we're still in touch. I spoke to her 2 days ago. Ray just turned 91, and he's finally given up driving. But Irina still plays piano. So and 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 she just looked at me during our dinner together, and she said, "How we got here, Ali, you and I," and that was it. I mean, I can't unpack. I can't go further than that. There is a process of mystery that I just allow to unfold, and I don't question it. The only clarity for me is that everyone participating in the film understands who I am, where I'm coming from, and there's mutual trust and respect. That's it.
I think at the end when you say, you talk about how the film's getting to you as a mystery, but then all you can do is honor it. I think that comes across, I think, for the audience. I mean, this is such a loving film in all sorts of ways in terms of how you love the material, how you see the family there. And I think for that, I think we're very grateful for your work. Are we allowing some questions from the audience? Yeah. Great.
Eager hand right up there.
I really like the film. Thank you for making the film. I have a lot of questions, so I'll try to squeeze all my questions in a go. So I think the film gave us a very nuanced representation of race in that era. So there is the subject of discrimination, the Chinese people, but at the same time, they are also the perpetrator of discrimination against other people. So I wonder, my first question is, did you have any sense of what Irina's direct experience of growing up in that kind of like limbo of both um, receiving a lot of discrimination, trauma, but also kind of actively, she wasn't allowed to marry a Korean or a Japanese, and at the same time, she was made to go to a white school. Like, how does she make sense of all those contradictory-ish message? Did you have a sense of that? And also, I'm interested in having grappled with the issue of race so much. What's your understanding of race? Like a very big question, but I'm very ambitious.
Let me answer the last question first because and I'll give you a short answer. One of my colleagues, who's also from India, said it quite succinctly, and I'll just paraphrase him. He said when he was in India, he read about race, but when he came to Canada, he lives race. And that's in a way says my experience around race is a lived experience, continues to be a lived experience. And the same with Irina. So we can intellectualize those things, we can ask those intellectual questions, but really I asked those questions to her, and the responses she gave me are the responses in the film. I think that what's remarkable about her, of someone of her generation, is that she's able to be quite candid and unafraid to speak to contradictions and acknowledge contradictions. You know, the speaking about what was happening in Chinatown when African Americans would come into restaurants. This was a matter of fact acknowledgement from her, and so it's difficult. So I asked everything that you've asked me in different ways, and what she responded with was her lived experience. And then it's up to us to try and figure out. And you know, it's a profoundly she is American. You know, she is, and she is, but yet very aware that she had a very specific background, that she is Chinese. And that's why it was important for me to interview Ray, for whom the Hawaiian experience was completely different, right? Just completely different. And he just names the distinction between his experience in Hawaii, growing up in this literally a multicultural, multiracial society that was predominantly Asian at the time, and Chicago, which was very segregated.
Thank you. I wonder regarding, there was a lot of free advertising for Sun Life. Have you approached Sun Life to possibly find out some more details about Ms. Fang, because she was a very successful saleswoman during that time, and in addition being Chinese American, but also for some sponsorship?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because the very first screening in Toronto, the premiere at Hot Dogs, I was approached by a young a Chinese Canadian woman who came and introduced herself to me. And she kept saying, I was just totally amazed. But I didn't expect what she was going to say next. But she said, I work for Sun Life. And she was pretty high up in marketing. And she said, my CEO should be seeing this film. And I said, okay, I'll send you the link, but I would like you to give me some information from your archives about Edith. I'd love to find out more. And I did share the link with them. And then they've gone completely silent. So unfortunately, as much as they seem to be, I would have liked a little bit more payback to that, to sharing my film with them. There's one more question.
Yeah, for me, the life insurance angle was actually quite interesting. My father was a life insurance salesman, and he would go to the Banff School, and he also was on the $1 Million Round Table, which
Wow.
is similar to Edith, and so it's a different type of nostalgia for me. So recently, one of my coworkers went to New York and met with the people of the Museum of Chinese in America. And one of the things that she most excitedly reported to me was, and they collect home movies. Home movies. She was very interested in that. And I was just wondering, you do a ton of this archival research, and I'm just curious, who's doing this work? You've done a bit of this work. Where, when people come to me or come to us at Centre, can I say, you can go here, you can go here, you can go here. This is where you're going to find these things, or just call Ali.
Well, sitting right behind you is Melanie from SFU, and as you know, SFU has a wonderful special collections. They have been gathering South Asian materials and other Asian materials. There is a growing interest in collecting, in gathering material histories of peoples. And home movies are becoming increasingly important in that process. But having said that, then the challenge becomes, they have to be digitized, they have to be conserved, and that often is a roadblock with archives, because there's a huge constraint on budgets for archives. But there is a growing interest in the moving image as archival material. I was just at last summer, two of my colleagues and I were invited to the plenary session of the Association of Canadian Archivists, and there was great interest in the moving image as history and as a document in its archive. The challenge with home movies is that more often than not, they don't come with any identifying information, unless they come directly from families. I've on eBay I bought another collection of this time it's a Japanese American family from the 60s, and again they're named. And no, I'm not going to do another film about it. It was just hard to do that film. But the Center for Asian American Media, CAM, in San Francisco is also collecting home movies. They have a great digitization project, and they're putting those home movies online.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ali and Chris. And I'd also like to thank all the volunteers who made tonight's event possible. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.